Good evening, and thank you for joining us for this live streamed presentation. Wildlife Conservation and Habitat Enhancement on the Pueblo of Santa Ana. I'm Krista Tyson. I'm the Visitor Services Manager at Pajarito Environmental Education Center, or lovingly known as PEEC. It's a nonprofit. We are a nonprofit that runs the Los Alamos Nature Center here in Los Alamos, New Mexico. So just some housekeeping for the talk tonight. If you are new to Zoom, if you move your mouse, you'll be able to see a toolbar. There will be a chat window, and I will be taking questions for the presenter, Glenn, tonight throughout the program, and I will relay questions to him when he has a pause between slides. I also would like to kindly request that you keep yourselves on mute and your video off during the program. That will help us focus on the presentation. And a little bit about the Los Alamos Nature Center. We are currently closed, but we still have lots of ways you can interact and connect with nature. Check the PEEC website, peeknature.org, for our Take It Outside initiative, especially during this closure, and for more live streamed presentations like this one. At the end of the talk, we will send an evaluation form to you by email. Your comments will help us improve future programs. We are able to offer programming at this time because of our wonderful members and donors, and I see some of you are on this call tonight. So thank you very much to our members and donors. Without you, we wouldn't be able to do what we do. So thank you. And I'm going to allow Glenn to hop on. So one moment. And I would like to introduce Glenn. So if you can't see the video, scroll to the upper corner and hit gallery view, and you should be able to see Glenn. All right, so welcome. Glenn Harper graduated from the University of New Mexico with a double BS in biology and psychology in 1992. After graduating, he worked at Natural Heritage New Mexico for 7 years, where he was tasked with surveying, monitoring, and mapping vegetation communities and rare and endangered plants and animals throughout the Southwest and in northern Mexico. Glenn began working as the Range and Wildlife Division Manager at the Pueblo of Santa Ana Department of Natural Resources in '99. In his current position, he is responsible for managing approximately 143,000 acres of semi-arid woodland, shrubland, and grassland habitats to promote flourishing plant communities and wildlife populations necessary for the Santa Ana people and maintain their traditional lifestyle. Fortunately, he is gifted with the support of the Tribal Council, Santa Ana community, and a department of dedicated professionals that work tirelessly in the field and in the office to help achieve Santa Ana's long-term natural resource goals. When he's not at work, Glenn spends much of his time exploring the outdoors with his wife and 2 children along the river or stream with a fly rod in hand. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Glenn. Thank you so much for doing this for us. We're excited.
Thank you, Krista. Am I coming through?
Yes, you are.
Great. Good evening, everybody. On behalf of myself and the Department of Natural Resources here at Santa Ana and Governor Lawrence Montoya and Lieutenant Governor Joey Sanchez, I'd like to thank Krista for inviting us to participate in the Pajarito Education Community, or the Pajarito Environmental Education Center, for allowing us to present this evening. Just to kind of go over a few things, I wanted to kind of talk about the Department of Natural Resources a little bit. We are a department that was established in, some would say 96, but really kicked in 1998. We have about 32 employees, 17 which are tribal. We're an interdisciplinary team made up of 6 divisions that include a GIS IT division, a water resources division, a Range and Wildlife Division, which is the division that I manage, a Restoration Division that deals with a lot of the riparian restoration along the Rio Jemez and the Rio Grande. And then we have our Conservation Enforcement Division and an environmental program that we've just started to look at air quality issues and solid waste issues and all the other environmental issues that we face here on the Pueblo. So with that, I guess I'll go ahead and start. Today's talk is Wildlife Conservation and Habitat Enhancement on the Pueblo of Santa Ana. And what I'd like to convey through this whole thing, and I hope you'll get the message, is that I'd like to let everybody know kind of where the Pueblo was at, what we've accomplished, and where we want to go. And to let everybody know that this really doesn't occur without a strong environmental education component. Our environmental education program, which is under a program of itself, has been really instrumental in educating the community about the things that we do at the department and the benefits that we're seeing. And I just can't say enough about the value of environmental education. So with that, so in 1994, UNM Press published this book called Santa Ana, The People, the Pueblo, and the History of Tamaya. And this is a book that's based on oral histories and the archaeological record. And it's kind of a deep read, but one of the slides that, or one of the plates that I saw in this book that I found really interesting was this plate. And the Santa Ana people, or the Tamayame, came out of the Chaco culture to the northeast. This is coming from the northeast and settled at Pa'aku, which is on the east side of the Sandia Mountains. These are the Sandia Mountains. And through the centuries, they had this counterclockwise movement towards the west, where they had camps and villages. They moved all the way through to the Black Mesa area, Mesa Prieta, all the way down through Laguna, continued down through Socorro, all the way back through Isleta, and then back at Pa'aku. And this occurred, this wasn't just the entire tribe, it was different branches of the Pueblo that moved through these areas. And to give you an idea of the scale of that, this is a digital elevation model, just kind of shows you the topographical features of the area. This is the Valles Caldera up here, Los Alamos sits over here, Taos and Socorro on the south end. So the green polygon on there shows about roughly 1.8 million acres. And that's kind of the area that they traversed in search of the resources that they needed to survive through the years. And when the Spanish arrived, they were basically where the star is. This is the traditional village of Tamaya, which is on the Jemez River. And essentially the area that star takes up is roughly about 17,000 acres. So they went from 1.8 million thousand acres, or million acres, and the kings of Spain granted them 17,000 acres to maintain their life on. And that, that's just a small chunk of land to do anything really for a culture. And since that time, they've been able to increase their land base. This area over here, the red polygon, is about 79,000 acres. This is, for the most part, you're gonna hear in this presentation everything we've been doing in this area. And in 2016, they purchased one of the last remaining legacy ranches that was owned by former Governor Bruce King. And that is roughly, that makes the land base about 139,000 acres. So they increased their land base from the Spanish grant about 800% during this time. And so it's, for a culture to maintain, to find all the plants and animal resources that they need to maintain their culture, even 139,000 acres isn't really a lot. And I think that's especially obvious now during this pandemic, when we panic when we go to the store and can't find toilet paper or flour for things. This culture used its landscape without any stores and maintained its livelihood just on the natural resources out there. So it became apparent to the tribal council when they established the Department of Natural Resources in the late 1990s that they had to start doing something to protect their resources. And so the Department of Natural Resources went out, and the first thing you have to do to figure out what you're going to protect is you have to find out what's out there. And so all those yellow dots up there on this map represent long-term vegetation monitoring plots where our department went out, collected lots of vegetation data and other environmental data from the sites to use as a long-term monitoring data set so we could evaluate change over time. And using the data that we collected at these locations, we were able to create vegetation classifications and then map those vegetation types across the landscape. And what you see here is basically a map of the green are the woodlands, the yellow or the brown is the grasslands, and this darker brown down here are shrublands. And so the area that we're talking about has about 12 miles of the Rio Jemez that comes in from the northwest, and about 6 miles of the Rio Grande. There's about a 1,300 foot gradient in elevation from the Rio Grande to the top of the Santa Ana Mesa. And there are about 300 or 800 community members registered here at the Pueblo, and they live in the contemporary villages along the Rio Grande in this area. And then also they maintain the traditional village of Tamaya, which is where they were when the Spanish arrived. So what are these resources? What are these community types or these habitat types that the Pueblo must protect to maintain their cultural identity? Well, there's about 4,800 acres of riparian shrubland and forest types, cotton gallery forests along the rivers. There's about 28,000 acres of grassland, shortgrass prairie grasslands and Chihuahuan desert grasslands. There's about 6,200 acres of this shrubland type, these Great Basin shrubland types and Chihuahuan desert shrubland types. By far the most dominant vegetation type out there is our one-seed juniper savannas. They roughly take up about 35,000 acres of the Pueblo's land base. And then one thing that we don't really think about too much as habitat are the agricultural fields along the Rio Grande, the irrigated agriculture, and there's about 1,200 acres of that. So these are basically the vegetation types out there on the landscape that are providing the plants for medicinal use, plants for traditional ceremonies, the forage for wildlife. This is what the tribe really has to protect. So to meet their long-term natural resource management goals, the Pueblo must be successful in protecting and managing these habitats from threats that are resulting from climate change. We hear about that all the time. We have 24 rain gauges that we've been monitoring for 20 years now. The number of rain gauges has changed a little bit through the years where we added more. And this graph shows water years, so between October through the end of September of each year. And the zero line is a baseline from a long-term monitoring weather station here in Bernalillo. And so in the year 2000, we were 27% below average in precipitation. And the following year, we're 18% above average. And so this gives you an idea of where we stand according to the long-term baseline in terms of precipitation. And so during that time, we've only had 2 wet years. We consider a wet year or a dry year if it's 25% outside of the baseline. So if it goes above this, we consider a wet year. If it goes below this line, it's considered a dry year. If it falls in between, it's considered an average year. During that time, we've only seen those 2 wet years, but we've seen 7 dry years. And even though this is above, biologically, this was a dry year. We received most of our precipitation on like September 15th, where we got 3 inches of rain and it really pushed us over. But from an ecological perspective, this was a drought year. And then the rest of them have been, 11 have been average. So in the early 2000s, the drought that killed a lot of the pinon up in the Los Alamos area and other areas in the Southwest, that's this drought right here. And then the more recent one between 2011 2012 and 2013 was a drought that, the most recent drought. And to give you an idea of what that can do across the landscape, this is a photo from one of our long-term monitoring plots that we established in 2000, or the photos from 2010. And then this is after the drought in 2013. This is such a drought period that it actually killed juniper, which is a pretty hardy species. And you look at it across the landscape, we had a massive canopy kill on juniper. If you added all the canopy areas up, just the canopies themselves, we had over 600 acres of juniper mortality. So climate change is obviously a big issue. That's no surprise. Overgrazing or overutilization of habitats by livestock is another issue where you see kind of a grassland conversion that hasn't been grazed as much as the grass, or as the side on the right, where you have snakeweed moving in, and you really are lacking the grasses that are there. Another is water, and in Pueblo culture, water is life. This is a photo in 1999 of a reservoir along the Rio Jemez. This is what it looked like in 2001. It had basically been, it's limited to a small thread of water coming through. And this was water that was evacuated during that early 2000s drought. Another thing that is a threat to the Pueblo is urban encroachment. The red boundaries, Santa Ana, these are the roads that are gridded from the Sandoval County map. Not all of this is developed, but it's actually been graded already, and will be developed in the future. Point is that urban communities are encroaching on Santa Ana land, and this is kind of what it looks like when you're flying over it, where you have Rio Rancho and Bernalillo on the south end of this. This is Highway 550, and as we look north to Santa Ana, big issue. So what is the Pueblo doing on its land to protect habitats from these threats? Well, we're starting with the largest community type, which is the 1C juniper Savannah type, and we looked at some historical photos. One from 1935. This is a section on the top of the Santa Ana Mesa, and this is the same section in 1998. And basically, what you see there is a doubling of juniper density across this particular area. And this is pretty standard in these savanna areas, where we've gone from about 15 trees per acre to 30 trees per acre, which isn't huge, not like when you compare it to coniferous forests, but it still has an effect on the landscape. And what you see here on the top is an area where you have a solid, or at least a well-developed grass layer between the trees. And what you see here is basically bare soil, small caliche-covered stones that were once in the soil profile, and as the grasses died off for various reasons, either drought or grazing or tree encroachment, those gravels, as the fine sediments blow away, those gravels become like a desert pavement on the surface. So this is something that we're trying to turn back. And so we set up some goals to restore savanna, to reduce the threat of catastrophic wildfire, to reinstate some fire on the landscape. We wanted to increase the perennial herbaceous cover and reduce bare ground cover. That's what's protecting soil, is perennial herbaceous cover, and enhance wildlife habitat. So we adopted a technique that was employed on Bandelier by Craig Allen, where you have these really fragile soils and you're trying to make sure that you don't do more damage by going in with heavy equipment. So, labor intensive, but it protects the site. We go out with chainsaws, manually reduce tree density. We lop the scatter. That's actually a tool on the ground to create microsites for vegetation reestablishment, to reduce wind and rain erosion. And then we haul out the heavy fuels so that we can prepare those sites for prescribed burns. And we get these mountains of juniper that come off of these sites, and we distribute them to the community. Everybody gets about 100 cubic feet, and we try to do that once a year. We've been doing this project since 2004. And so the amount of wood that we have distributed, if you imagine a cord of wood, which is 4 by 4 by 8, I believe, if you imagine a cord of wood stacked the height of 4 Empire State Buildings, that's how much fuel we provided to the community. And they use this fuel mostly up at the traditional village of Tamaya, where cooking and heating is really all driven by wood. Then we come out afterwards, after we've thinned the site and put some fire on the landscape. And so this is an example of what that would look like before and after. This is a site that before I kind of put that black oval in there to show you a reference point. This is before we thinned it. This is after we manually thinned it. This is after we burned it, a kind of a patchy burn. And so we went from this to this. And one of the things that's kind of striking here is the amount of the decrease in bare ground that you see from this photo. So we've accomplished this across about 6,000 acres so far. The red polygons on this map show the areas that we've completed. The yellow polygons show the areas that we burned. We haven't been as successful in burning because of usually when it's a good time to burn, nobody wants to burn because of the fire threat, but that is the time that these ecosystems lit up and burned, was really when it's really dry. And then the green areas are areas that we had planned. And so we worked with the SIPI, which is the Southwestern Indian Polytech Institute located here in Albuquerque. Under their range and wildlife program down there, we had their students come out and participate in doing some of the vegetation monitoring on these sites. And basically what we found is this is one vegetation plot, and the top is ground cover and the bottom graph is canopy cover. So what we want to do is reduce bare ground. So the blue histogram here shows that about 75%. And after we've thinned and burned, we've reduced bare ground to 55%, which is one of our objectives. And then we've also increased basal vegetation. Basal vegetation is the area that a plant takes up as it comes out of the ground. So if you mow the plant down right to ground level, that's what you're measuring when you're measuring basal vegetation. Canopy covers everything else that grows out of it. And so we doubled our canopy cover, and we basically maintained our reduction in tree cover. So I think that at least at this plot, we have some controls that we have to continue to monitor as well, but they're not seeing the changes that we're seeing here. And so this is good for us from a department perspective to be able to provide this sort of information to our partners and to the tribal council to show that the stuff we're doing on the field is beneficial. One of the things that kind of came out of this was we had a deer collaring project going on, and that particular plot that I just showed you the graph for, you can see this is the center of the plot. That PVC is the center of the vegetation plot. After we burned it in March of 2011, and 4 months before that, we had GPS collared some deer. We didn't get any rain on that site for 6 months. We really didn't get any rain till September. And it was one of those scenarios where you just never know if you're going to get the rain after it burned. But we got like 3 inches of rain in September that year, and things really popped up. And what was interesting is that during that time from when we collared these deer in November of 2010 through when we burned it in March of 2011, and then finally when things greened up in September of 2011, there were no yellow dots on this map. And so these yellow dots are mule deer locations, GPS locations. The red polygon is the area that we burned, and the green polygon is the area that we thinned, and everything on this side of the red polygon is an area that we thinned and didn't burn. So, the fact that there weren't any locations on this site, any deer locations on this site, until it greened up in September and then the deer really hit it, is really promising and provides good support for us to go to the tribal council and try to seek their support for continued burning. Because it was kind of a neat little side project that popped up. And the Pueblo is, we're doing work in the uplands. We're also doing a lot of work in the riparian areas. The Pueblo was a leader along the Rio Grande beginning in 1998 doing riparian restoration. Maybe you're all familiar with the issues with the Rio Grande where you have damming, the Cochiti Dam and all the other dams that control water flows in the river, and the diversions and the jetty jacks to straighten the river that were put in years ago. All of these things had an impact on the quality of the riparian habitat, and really just narrowed the channel, incised it, and pretty much eliminated overbank flooding, which is what regenerates new stands of riparian vegetation. So the Pueblo started working within its reach of the river to try to expand that active flood channel. And we had to go in there and physically move soil, create backwaters such as this. This is a backwater. Here's the river, the Rio Grande here. And the idea is that as the river fills and CFS goes up, and these areas become flooded. And you can see that we planted willows in there to kind of get things going. And after the floods come in, that's kind of what it looks like. And then after a few years later, you've established cottonwoods and willows and other species, riparian species in there. This is the sort of thing that we're trying to do to expand the active flood channel to promote that habitat that's really beneficial for wildlife and for medicinal plants as well. And so when you look at it from above, you can see that this is kind of the old channel. This is sometimes in size up to 10, 15 feet. So it's hard to get that water out of that river channel across the bank. And so you can see up here, you kind of lower the bank so you get water moving through. You created several little channels for the water to move through. This is called a swale, willow swale back here, where it's a depression where we planted vegetation. And then this continues up the 6 miles reach of the Rio Grande. And it's really created this wonderful riparian habitat that is missing along a lot of areas along the Rio Grande in New Mexico. And we're doing a lot of bird monitoring, and we're monitoring herps and small mammals. And one of the interesting things is that the yellow warbler, which we had not seen breeding on Santa Ana, has moved into these kind of newly formed riparian areas and is actually nesting. We're also seeing Mississippi kites out there nesting, which is kind of an unusual species. And Lucy's warbler seems to be moving up from the south and is breeding on the Pueblo. And then we're seeing these kind of what I would normally regard as a coniferous obligate for breeding. We're seeing Plumius, vireos nesting in cottonwoods, and then phainopeplas are also moving up. So it's just kind of an interesting, we're providing, I think the most interesting thing is that we're providing habitat for these yellow warblers, and they kind of require similar habitats to what willow flycatchers require. And a lot of this work, a lot of this revegetation and active river channel expansion is really meant to provide the habitat that might attract a willow flycatcher. And I was pleased to say that after many, many years of doing surveys and restoration work, that the Pueblo finally identified and located the first willow flycatcher nest in 2017. Unfortunately, they failed, but we suspect that they did come back to try to nest again, but at least the male did. We have territories, at least a couple of territories showing up in the river right now, but we haven't detected any more nesting. It really seems to be related to the river flows, and the river flows this year have been pretty bad. And last year, where they were actually almost too high because the water wasn't lentic or slow moving, it was kind of rushing through the willows, and flycatchers really like that lentic water. And another species that we're seeing down in the Rio Grande is the yellow-billed cuckoo, which is a threatened species. And we're pretty sure they're nesting. We haven't located their nest, but our wildlife program manager caught one, not caught one, but saw one with some food in its mouth. And these guys are really kind of hard to key in on their nests. And once it saw that the wildlife program manager had seen her, the cuckoo ate what it had and just took off. So anyway, we think that they're still breeding down there. Another part of the active river restoration work in the channel is the habitat enhancement for the silvery minnow. And we've been working with the Fish and Wildlife Service to actually release minnows in this area. It's kind of a stronghold since we don't suspect that it will dry out as other areas down south are. On the historical floodplain, the areas that really don't see any flooding anymore, this is where you see these giant cottonwoods, and in some places you see a lot of Russian olive and a lot of salt cedar that have moved in. The tribe has worked on this historical floodplain to reduce fuels and restore the habitat. To give you an idea of what the fuels look like out there, this is a combination of Russian olive and salt cedar, basically an impenetrable wall. This is a long-term photo point, and this is the same point after we removed the salt cedar and the Russian olive. And really, this is a community type that you see in other places in New Mexico is cottonwood and alkali saccaton, which is the grass component under here. And it's what you see on these old historical terraces.
Hi, Glenn.
Yeah.
I have a couple questions coming in. And since you were just talking about the salt cedars, if it's okay, I interrupt. Yeah. Sure. Is there still work happening to get rid of salt cedars?
It's a maintenance thing along the Rio Grande. For the most part, the large stands of salt cedar, Russian olive have been removed. The restoration division is working up into the Jemez section of the Pueblo, the real Jemez, and there's a lot of salt cedar to work on up there. So no, it has most of the work on the Rio Grande has been completed, but not along the Jemez. You have another question?
Yes, please. Will the historic floodplains be restored so the old and young cottonwoods there can survive?
That's a good question. You know, cottonwoods require flooding to regenerate. Some of these trees are 50, 60 years old. We've had mortality, cottonwood mortality along the Rio Grande that's related to low river flows. So at some point, you know, you may not be able to have the cottonwood gallery forest footprint that you had in the past, and it may just turn more into an upland community type because it is so removed from the hydrologic conditions of the river. We have pole planted on the terrace, and we've been successful at growing cottonwoods that way. But it just depends on how low the river really goes. And a lot of the work in the active part of the river channel has been to arrest that incision, that river incision, to stop it from incising more. Because as you incise the river more, then your water table drops more, and it presumably drops out of the reach of the cottonwood root system. So we are planting poles, but I think that unless we are really able to get water on these historical floodplains, that the expanse of cottonwood gallery forests will be reduced over time, especially if we see these really minimal runoff events where the river really isn't recharging everything. Ready?
Good to go, thanks.
So with this sort of work, you know, in the Rio Grande Bosque, that opened up an opportunity to bring in a traditionally important species that had been extirpated for over 40 years when we first released them. And so we worked with the United States Fish and Wildlife Service Tribal Wildlife Grants Program and Mescalero Apache Tribe and the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish to restore a wild turkey population, a Merriam's wild turkey population. And so between 2004 and 2006, we released 64 wild turkeys on the Pueblo. And it soon became apparent after you release these birds, they show up in the weirdest places. We've had them go all the way down into Bernalillo. We've had them in Sandia Mountains. We've had them in the Jemez Mountains, and as far up north as Cochiti Pueblo. But the ones so you lose about half after you release your birds. And then the ones that did stay started building a population. And one of the reasons I think we've had over a pretty good poult success, I think it was 57% of the poults the nests survived. And so one of the reasons I think that we've done a pretty good job here is that there isn't any grazing along the Rio Grande. And so you can see all that vegetation there. And when a hen has poults, they're really most susceptible during the first 2 weeks where they can't fly. And just to give you an idea what that cover does, all those green arrows are turkey poults. If you look a little closer, you can kind of see them. They really depend on their camouflage and working with the vegetation to protect them from from predators such as owls and Cooper's hawks and coyotes and bobcats and everything wants to eat turkey, I guess. So our population, you know, has kind of, we're not exactly where we want to be, but I think we've been kind of successful in, you know, we had a real bottleneck here during the drought where some birds dispersed and never came back. And then now we're climbing up again, up to 38. So ideally we'd like to have close to 100 birds across the reservation. So we're far from our goal, but we've had a couple of issues with birds leaving and not coming back. So with that turkey reintroduction, the tribe was interested in restoring another important species to the landscape, and that's the pronghorn antelope. And from 2009 to 2017, during those years, we released 100 pronghorn across the reservation, and we've run into some issues with predation, and you know, just like the turkeys, a lot of these animals left the reservation boundaries and never came back. But our population was kind of in the 30s, 40s, and now it's getting up into the 50s and 60s. And this year, yesterday, I saw 3 does with at least 5 or 6 fawns. So hopefully it'll be a good year for fawning. So the lack of water in that photo under where the reservoir was drained and the river basically is just a small stream that's perennial and dry really during the time of year when most animals need water, has led us to kind of start developing water. So we've developed 5 solar powered wells on the landscape, and then we take those water from those wells and those storage tanks and some of the existing wells out there. We put 23 miles of water lines to distribute that water, and those pipelines distribute water to these wildlife drinkers. We put in 33 of these wildlife drinkers, and this is kind of a picture that I'm particularly fond of because it has 6 species. It's got a flicker, mountain bluebird, a robin, Townsend solitaire, Cassin's finch, sage thrasher, and I think that's it. But it's just, you know, different, we see upwards of 61 different bird species using these. And we're also seeing, you know, ungulates using them and larger predators such as this bear, they use them. This is a summertime photo. I think it was like 100 degrees, and then he decided that he needed to sit in the water for a little bit. And then we put in 27 of these troughs along those pipelines. They're either rubber tire troughs like this one or steel rim troughs. These are for livestock as well, but we also have large ungulates using them. And we've put in 5 solar powered ponds. Most of them are solar powered. I think 4 of them are solar powered. This one was put in particularly for the pronghorn reintroduction. And then one of the things I've been really happy with are these guzzlers. We put in 9 of these guzzlers, and what a guzzler is this is a Boss tank guzzler, and it stores up to 1,800 gallons of water, and it collects water here on the dome, and then it stores it. And, you know, we only get 8 to 9 inches of rain on average. So to increase that water yield of collection, we create these aprons, and all this water flows down to a rain gutter, and then it comes in through the back. These things have worked out great. Once they're in the ground, unless it's really, really droughty and you have a lot of use on them, you never really have to touch them again. They're self-sufficient. So we put 9 of those in. Another thing that we're working on in terms of wildlife habitat is we're doing some working with the ag department at Santa Ana to do some crop sharing, where they leave some of their standing corn out in the field. Obviously, we're along the Rio Grande is a major migratory path, and we keep that stuff out there for cranes and geese and other waterfowl that come through. And another source of food that we're putting out there is we're doing some browse planting, which is basically, this is mountain mahogany, and mountain mahogany is noticeably absent from the Pueblo, but as you get further away from the Rio Jemez, it starts to show up. And my guess is that in the late 1800s, there were a tremendous amount of sheep and cattle and on the landscape. The only real perennial source of water, even if it was perennial, was the Rio Jemez. So, you know, you had a big impact on these shrubs, and they're conspicuously missing from those areas. So we're going in those areas and replanting. to give you an idea of how, you know, Mount Mahogany is like candy to deer. And I love this photo because this deer shows up at 10:49 and he's an efficient defoliator. If you look at the leaves on that thing, and 6 minutes later, he's basically reduced it to just a stalk. So then we learned we better put cages on them. And so we now put cages on these. And really, we're not really putting these out there as a source of food, although they are used for food, but we're really trying to reestablish a seed source in the area so that it can start to regenerate on its own. We've probably put about 2,500 plants out on the landscape. So then, you know, we talked about the grazing overutilization of landscapes, of rangelands by cattle or feral horses. One of the things that we did early on in the 2000s was fence the entire stretch of the Rio Jemez corridor on the Pueblo of Santa Ana. So that's about, that green polygon shows you about 16,000 acres of area that was fenced off, and we removed the feral cattle that were in there and the feral horses. And just this sort of management activity has benefits that you can see pretty easily through photographs. This is a photo that was taken in 1999 at one of our long-term monitoring plots. Everything green out, even though it's kind of green, it was kind of a wet year. It's all annual weedy things or snakeweed. There's really not much grass on the site. It's providing some cover, I guess, for soil, but it's not really what we're desiring. So after we put that fencing up and excluded the livestock from this area, this is the same spot in 2006. Really want to point out, if you look to this area right here, this is sand sage. This is pretty much a bonsai sand sage here. But then you see it kind of explode. And you know, this obviously provides a lot of good nesting cover for grassland species or shoveling nesting bird species. It also provides good browse for ungulates. So just a simple management activity can have benefits on the landscape. And then we looked at what the animals were telling us. All these red dots up here represent deer and elk locations from, I believe it's 20 deer and elk. And if you remove one bull elk and one buck mule deer, that's what you see. And this is pretty telling to me. It's like, what's going on? Why aren't the red dots in these areas? And well, if you overlay the areas of our grazing units in blue, then you can kind of get an idea of where I'm going with this. And this was an area that had a high density of feral horses. It wasn't grazed by cattle, it was feral horses. And these are cattle grazing pastures. This is within a cattle grazing pasture, but it hasn't been grazed for the 20 years that I've worked at Santa Ana, so you can kind of see they moved in. So what's happening out there, and this is kind of the whole philosophy that we have in terms of our livestock grazing and our landscape or rangeland management is, you know, a lot of these areas were being grazed down 70 to 80% utilization. That means that anything that came up from the ground that year, the cattle or the horses were taking 70 to 80% of that biomass. And consequences of overgrazing have been pretty well noted. And basically you get progressively shorter root systems as you remove the grass, as you remove the solar panel. I mean, if you think of a grass blade as a solar panel collecting energy from the sun, transforming that energy into its root system, stored it in its root system, a plant that has more of a solar panel is going to be able to store more energy. And so you see this progressive drop off in the root system. And this is super important, especially with climate change, because our goal is really to manage the landscape where we manage healthy plants with large root systems that can persist during these drought events where you don't have high grass mortality on the landscape. And so what the science shows is basically that at 50% utilization, so that means that if you had 1 pound of grass coming up out of the ground one year, if you took half a pound off of that, you'd see a decrease in root growth by 2 to 4%. But if you only took 40% of that above ground production, you see zero growth stoppage, root stoppage. And so that's where we kind of set our line to try to restore these grasslands out here, is to work with the cattlemen to establish these grazing limits. And so we went out to these sites, these yellow dots again, and we started collecting. We know what's growing out there, but we don't know how much of it in terms of pounds per acre. So we had to go out and set up these clip plots where you go and collect above ground production. We try to do this on a dry or an average or a wet year. We have really got a good reference point for the wet year because we just haven't had them, but we manage at a dry year because we're basically somewhere between average and dry in our annual precip. So we take this and we run it through these fancy models where you take the satellite imagery and you create a veg classification and you map those communities, and then you do reductions because livestock will tend to use areas closer to water. So this area right here is distance to water. All these points are water sources. And so the green area is a 0% reduction in cattle activity. The kind of tan area or orange area is another reduction. And then usually when they're out in the red, that means that the cattle aren't spending a lot of time there. We took some consideration of the tree cover basal effect that reduces a cow's ability to get to grass under a tree. And then we looked at terrain where cattle are less likely to use steeper slopes and they prefer flatter slopes. So I'm going to go through this real quick. You take one pasture and then you add the vegetation types within it, and you take your reductions. You know, that circle right there is part of that reduction around a water source or lack of reduction. And then basically what it spits out is the amount of available forage that you have if you took 40% of what's grown out there. And then you do the math and you're able to come up with carrying capacities. And in this instance, that pasture, you know, has 323,851 pounds of forage available to it. So this is important, and it's backed by the Pueblo adopted the livestock code, the Pueblo livestock code in 2018. And then another code that they adopted was in 2005, they adopted the Wildlife Conservation Code and established the Santa Ana Conservation Enforcement Division. Now, to give you an idea of what that does, basically hunting had been unregulated for, it was just unregulated hunting on the Pueblo. And as soon as the code went in, this is where the code went in, and this is basically a graph that shows our aerial game surveys that we do, minimum population size between 2000, looks like I'm missing one there, it's 2003 through 2019. And basically, this isn't all the animals out there, this is what you count. It's basically about half of what exists out there, but you see this kind of sharp increase in the population once you establish a code and then you enforce it through the enforcement division. And then in 2011, the Pueblo opened up draw hunting, so we closed it down for 6 years, and they've been successful and everything's been going great. And then suddenly we see this kind of plateau, this leveling off here, and we're like, this isn't a result of just the two-legged predators. This is really a result of something else. So around 2009, we start seeing these large predators show up, bears. We've been running camera traps for 3 to 4 years before this, and we never detected a bear or a lion. But as soon as the ungulate population started going up, the predators started showing up. And so 2010, this is the first photo we captured of a lion. And so we were interested, are they having an effect on controlling the upward expansion of the ungulate population? And these are small ungulate populations. They're very low density, so it's really easy to keep them kind of pushed down, and it's difficult for them to expand when you're kind of in a contained area and you don't have a lot of reproduction each year because you just don't have a lot of does or cow elk. So we were interested in looking at if these guys were responsible, if these predators were responsible. So we started collaring bears, but this is Scabby Butt. We call him Scabby Butt because he always had cockleburs on his rear end when he'd show up on camera. But we collared him twice. His neck is thicker than his head, so he was able to pull off his collar both times. But we were successful in collaring another 2 bears, one male and one female. And this is the data that came up from that. It shows that they go way up into the haymas, they come down and they seem to forage along in the fall on Russian olive or juniper berries in this country. If it's a dry winter, you can almost be sure that they're going to be down here in the fall, trying to find food in summer and fall. And in terms of what they were eating, we really didn't find much except for we know they chewed on some old scavenged cow carcasses. This is basically ant They massacred an ant pile. This is, mowing down sedges and grasses, and they love juniper berries and a bunch of fruits. And so we never detected a predation event by these bears. Not that bears don't predate ungulates or other animals, but we didn't detect it. And it's a small size population or sample size. Now lions, on the other hand, we looked at, we started collaring lions in, this lion was collared in March of 2017. This is an adult male, a big adult male. And we caught him using dogs, obviously. And we caught broken leg, which is another adult male, and caught him the same year in May of 2017. And then we caught our first adult female in February of 2018. This is Notch. She has a barely see a little notch right there in her ear. And then she seems to be our producer out here. This is Notch with her 3 kittens. This was in 2017. Before we had actually collared her, but we picked her up quite a bit on camera. And you can still see that notch in her ear. And then right about April 2018, so this is September 2017, and then these cats released, and we caught what we suspect is one of her daughters, which we call Little Girl in 2018. And we caught her brother, which is, we called him Lefty. And then Notch, again, had another litter of kittens. She went into her den in October of 2018. Yeah, it was 2018. And this is from November of 2019. So these lions here, there's Notch right here in the middle with their collar on. And then these lions here are surviving. She had 3 kittens, but only 2 survived. And we ended up catching her son, and we called him Squeaks because he squeaked a lot. Now, so the most complete data set we have for the lions is broken leg. He's been collared about 21 months. And you can see it extends all the way to Tent Rocks, Cochiti, all the way down here by Black Mesa. This is the Rio Puerco. I'm gonna go through these slides really quickly. I can see the time is running out. And then if you look at here's the different colors represent different lions. Notch and Little Girl, Little Girl is Notch's daughter, almost have the same range, even after they release from the mom. And then this is Broken Leg, this green, and this is Lefty, which you normally see as males leave the natal range and went all the way down here. All the way, this is highway, this is I-40 right here, right at the bridge where it crosses by the casino. Huge range. And what are they eating? Well, they're eating anything from as large as feral horses to bull elk, cow elk, and even burros on the Mesa Prieta. There's some feral burros on that side. And they're also eating smaller size ungulates like deer and pronghorn antelope and even exotic feral species that we found out there. This is a mouflon ram that we had no idea was out there, but Broken Leg was able to go harvest that. They're also eating porcupines, and they kind of skin these guys from, and I don't know how they're able to perform that surgery on them, but they're able to eat everything. And it seems like they don't get the quills in them. They love beavers and they don't like beaver tails. So it's like I think it's only been once that I've found a kill that had a missing tail. They're even eating sandhill cranes and other predators such as coyotes, badgers. And so people have always asked me, how do you know what they're eating? Well, the GPS collars that they're wearing collect positions every 2 hours. And those positions are transmitted to a satellite twice a day. And so I'm able to come in the morning and look at where that lion was at the night before. And so all of their kills that we found have been at night. And so this is an example. The lion came down from where the red arrow is, killed a mule deer, and then would go over here in bed, go back, go bed, go all the way down to the river on the Rio Jemez, and go back and eat it at night. So basically what we do is we see those clusters, we get the GPS coordinates, and we go out and visit the site to confirm what they're eating. So Broken Leg, which is like I said, the most complete data set that we have, he loves badgers. He also loves elk and coyotes and beavers, and he's killed a few deer, but he doesn't seem to be having an impact on the mule deer population, but maybe something on the elk population. Combined across all those different lines that we've caught and monitor their prey base. These are all different because the collars, some of them went out, some lasted longer than others. So they're shorter durations for like Little Girl or Big Tom, these blue, what's interesting here is that we have 3 lions that are killing feral horses and 2 males that are killing badgers. And so another interesting thing is that Squeaks, which is the son of Notch, has released from her. And so these gold dots here that you see on the map is Notch's home range, basically. And the green dots are, since the time that we caught Squeaks, the young male, those are his green dots. Those are where he was at, basically hanging out with his mother. And then we see this kind of expansion where a male is going to leave the territory. It looks like he tried to go up towards Tent Rocks, turned back around, and then he went towards I-25 and turned back around. And then he went out towards Santo Domingo, Buttigieg's area, turned back around. And then he went out towards Zia and hit 550, turned back around, and turned back around when he hit 550 again. And just on Sunday night, he was right at the edge of I-25 and turned back towards the Bosque. So we see this it seems like this cat is trying to move through, trying to release from its natal ground or territory to find a new territory, but it's being blocked by these roads. And so we have this space and connectivity issue across this particular area. And a lot of that we know because we've collared a lot of these large animals that require large home ranges to forage and breed and migrate. We have data on it. And this is kind of what it looks like. It's this mass blast of green dots of where these animals are roaming all the way up near the Valles Caldera, up near Elephant Butte. This is pronghorn that wouldn't cross I-25. These are lion and elk crossing in this area and deer. We see turkeys crossing over here. So we understand at this point that these animals have large home ranges, and for the Pueblo to be successful in monitoring or to meet its long-term natural resource goals, they're going to have to reach outside of their boundaries and work with the neighbors to try to work collaboratively to improve and protect wildlife habitat. And it could start just simply by looking at roadways. This is Highway 550 right here. This is I-25. Where you see the blue is where we find most of our wildlife vehicle collisions, and this is what you end up with. So providing safe passage for these animals across is a good start in trying to connect these different areas of habitat so that you have continuity. And then the other thing is that we are trying to work with our neighbors, our neighboring tribes, and you can imagine that the green is just Santa Ana, but if you add in Isleta, Toajali, Acoma, Laguna, Sandia, Jemez, Santo Domingo, San Felipe, and Zia Pueblo, and San Ildefonso, and Santa Clara Pueblo, you have a green swath of tribal lands. And the tribes all share that necessity of having vibrant and flourishing wildlife populations. So there's a real good opportunity to work together across a really large landscape to protect wildlife corridors and to improve wildlife habitat. Because really what we're trying to get to is are these linear features in the landscape like roads and communities. We need to have safe passage for these animals to cross, just like they're crossing a linear feature, but it's this river instead. So I kind of sped up at the end because I can see it's 8:01. But I did want to acknowledge a lot of the folks that we work with. It's we don't work within a box. We work with a lot of different agencies and state, federal, and nonprofit. And with that, thank you.
Thank you. We do have some questions that came through. If you're okay with staying on a few extra minutes, we'd be grateful.
No, absolutely. I'd be happy to answer any questions, anything anybody has.
Are they working with people who are pushing wildlife corridors?
Is the Pueblo? Yes, absolutely. Yes. The Pueblo was really lobbied in support of the New Mexico Wildlife Corridors Act that was recently passed. And yeah, it's in the Pueblo's best interest to make sure that their landscape remains connected to other landscapes, and to ensure that there are avenues for dispersal and for immigration onto the landscape. So yes, the tribe is working. We're working with, right now we're working with Defenders of Wildlife to do some more intensive modeling of the data that we have, to look at finer corridor level or finer level corridor crossings so that we can really push for doing mitigation along those stretches of highway. And we're also looking at areas where animals are moving through currently so that we know that we know what areas to protect for the future.
Great, thanks. Are any of the turkeys harvested? If so, for what purpose?
Feathers are well, just the presence of wild turkeys on the Pueblo is important. But we have harvested turkeys. We have a draw system for them. The feathers, I mean, the turkeys are harvested for food and for religious and ceremonial reasons.
Great, thanks. Has there ever been a kill in the early AM or late PM when there's light in the sky? I think you mentioned that all the mountain lion kills are in the nighttime.
Yeah, all the you know, they've killed at 7 in the morning when it's light, but it's basically between that, you know, dawn and dusk is when lions are out active feeding and hunting. It's surprising how they, you know, they seem to kind of during the day just lay under a rock somewhere and don't move until about 5, 6 o'clock in the afternoon. And then they get up and start moving. We haven't detected, we went to all these locations where they were bedding up during the day and found that they were just bedding up. And so it didn't take us very long to stop visiting those sites because we were going to find the same thing over and over again. I'm sure that they're opportunistic, so if something walked by their bedding area, I'm sure they would chase it down and eat it.
Great, thank you. How far do the mountain lions travel in one day, or rather during the night?
You know, that's a good question. I can't think of the numbers off the top of my head, but you know, 15 miles is not really that unusual. 10 miles is pretty common, unless of course they kill something. Broken leg, we suspect that he was hit by a car, and that's why he has this big knot calcification on his knee. We had a report on 550 that someone had hit a mountain lion and that it ran off, and our conservation enforcement division went out there, tried to verify it, and they never found the lion. And then suddenly we started seeing this lion show up on our camera traps that had this bulbous right knee. But he has been able to, knock on wood, he crosses 550, basically at will. I think he's kind of figured it out, but he will go from the Jemez River all the way to the Puerco in one night.
Sounds like we need some mountain lion crossing signs for 550.
Yeah.
All right. Does the Jemez River have a constant flow of water down the Rio Grande? Is much diverted for use?
The Jemez River pretty much runs dry unless we get some good precip. It generally dries. It's dry right now. It usually runs dry about by mid-May to early June, and it depends. You know, there's a lot of irrigation use up the river towards, you know, San Isidro and Jemez Pueblo and Ponderosa and Jemez Springs. You know, that water's being used up there, so it runs dry for a good part of the year down here, unless we have really good precip, and then it can actually flow year round.
Got it. How many active native producers are farmers and ranchers that the DNR partners with for conservation?
I couldn't tell you in terms of the irrigated pasture producers, but in terms of the livestock producers that are using rangeland, there are 3 different groups. Those groups consist of different community members that have access to a certain pasture lands on the reservation. So yeah, the number might be, just off the top of my head, maybe 30 or 40.
Thank you. What is it like working with the tribe to implement these projects?
Oh, that's a good question. You know, when you work with a community that had names for deer and elk and pronghorn and all the other wildlife that they depend on, when you work with a community that had names for those animals before Europeans came here, you know, it's deep. It's just, for me, it's really deep because you know, we call things pronghorn, we call things elk, and the tribe has been depending on these animals for centuries, and to be able to help bring that back, that on the landscape, is really what drives me to work hard and to develop projects that can improve the natural resources for the department. And you know, it helps to have a tribal community that's mostly in support. We're not always the most popular department on the block, especially when we come up with a wildlife code or a livestock code. That usually doesn't tend to set well with too many people. But overall, it's the community support has been great. I've watched kids go from our outreach programs in their, you know, when they're in elementary school to working within our department now. And that is very rewarding.
Thank you. I have another question. Is there a problem with ranchers?
No, there's, you know, the ranching community is part, you know, the ranching community is part of the tribal council, and the tribal council adopted the livestock code because they understand the value of doing managed grazing. And, you know, you can do both. It's just a matter of how you treat the landscape.
Thanks. And I think we have time for one more question. And this pertains to your previous discussion 2 questions ago. So I'm going to tack this one on. How much do you work with the tribal leaders, and how much autonomy do you have doing this work?
We work very closely with the tribal government, the governor's office, the traditional leaders, and the tribal council. We have a limited amount of autonomy. Everything that we do is approved by tribal council. All of our projects have to go and usually have to receive a resolution. If not, the tribal council has to be in support of it. And you know, that's important because we work for the tribal community and the tribal council. So to try to do things outside of their, without their blessing is just the wrong way to do it. So we have a really good working relationship with the governors, and we have a lot of support from the governor's office. Our department does, and the traditional leaders as well.
Thank you very much. Okay, those are all the questions that came in from the viewers. Glenn, thank you so much again for sharing this presentation with us.
Thank you.
It was fascinating. Yes, thank you so much. I would like to also thank our guests for joining us tonight. If you'd like to join us again, guests, please just visit our PEEC website for more information and to register for upcoming live talks. And thanks again. Thank you for joining us. And Glenn, very fascinating work that you're doing. We really enjoyed it.
Great. Thank you, Krista, for having us. And thank you everyone else for listening in. And I apologize for running late on it. I kind of sped through the last part of it, which I think is probably the most interesting part, but hopefully you got the idea of what the Pueblo has been involved with.
Yes, it was great. And the timing was perfect. It's just fun. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.